My name is Alyssa. I'm 27 years old and I work as an art therapist in Boston. Growing up in a small town in Idaho, I was the invisible child in my own home. My parents were so wrapped up in their careers that they barely noticed I existed. The shocking part, they didn't even realize I had moved across the country 3 years ago. Now out of the blue, my father called with an ultimatum that has turned my world upside down. If you've ever felt invisible to the people who should love you most, this story might resonate with you. Before I start, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe if you want to hear more stories like mine. I grew up in a sprawling 2-story house on the outskirts of a small town in Idaho. From the outside, it looked like the perfect family home, with its manicured lawn and white picket fence. Inside, it was cold and empty, much like my relationship with my parents. My father, Richard, was a hospital administrator who prided himself on running the only medical center in our county with ruthless efficiency. My mother, Diana, was a real estate agent who specialized in luxury properties, often driving hours away to show homes to wealthy clients from bigger cities. Their careers weren't just jobs, they were obsessions that consumed every waking moment. My earliest memories involve a rotating cast of nannies. There was Katie, who lasted almost a year before she quit after another argument with my mother about working overtime. Then came Marissa, who would forget to pick me up from kindergarten. After her was Teresa, who spent most of her time talking on the phone to her boyfriend. None of them stayed long enough for me to form any real attachment. "Alyssa, we work so hard to give you a good life," my mother would say whenever I expressed any disappointment about their absence. "Do you know how many children would love to have what you have? What I had were toys, clothes, and a big house. What I didn't have was parents who remembered I existed." My 8th birthday stands out in my memory. I had been excited for weeks, carefully creating handmade invitations for a small party. The day arrived and neither of my parents were home. My father had an emergency board meeting and my mother was showing properties 3 towns over. The cake they had ordered was delivered, but there was no one to sing happy birthday. I sat alone at our dining room table, 8 candles flickering in the dimness, and blew them out without making a wish. I had already learned wishes didn't come true. School became my refuge. I threw myself into academics, bringing home perfect report cards and certificates of achievement. These would sit on the kitchen counter for days, sometimes weeks, before disappearing into the trash without comment. Still, I persisted, hoping that one day my accomplishments would be significant enough to make them notice me. Art was where I found my voice. In 6th grade, Ms. Wilson, my art teacher, praised a watercolor I had painted of our backyard. "You've captured such loneliness in this piece, Alyssa," she said. "Art is a wonderful way to express feelings we can't put into words." That was the first time anyone had recognized what I was feeling, and it opened a floodgate. I painted and drew constantly after that, filling sketchbooks with images of empty rooms, solitary figures, and distant horizons. By the time I was 10, I started experiencing symptoms of anxiety and depression, though I wouldn't have named them that at the time. I had trouble sleeping, frequent stomach aches, and a persistent sadness that followed me like a shadow. The school counselor called my parents once after finding me crying in the bathroom. My mother took me to a pediatrician who said it was probably just growing pains and suggested I join a sport to burn off energy. The one bright spot in my childhood was my grandmother, my father's mother, who lived about 20 minutes away. Grandma Rose was everything my parents weren't: warm, attentive, and genuinely interested in my life. I would ride my bike to her house whenever I could, and she would make me cinnamon toast and listen to me talk about school friends and the books I was reading. "Some people aren't meant to be parents, sweetheart," she told me once when I was crying about another forgotten school event. "It doesn't mean they don't love you in their own way. It just means you have to find your people elsewhere." I didn't understand what she meant then, but her words would come back to me years later when I was building my own chosen family. My grandmother taught me to knit, bake cookies, and tend a garden. More importantly, she taught me that I was worthy of attention and love, even if my parents couldn't see it. She came to every school play, art show, and awards ceremony that my parents missed, which was nearly all of them. When she applauded, I felt seen. Looking back on those early years, I can see how I was developing the independence and self-reliance that would eventually allow me to break free. I learnt to cook basic meals by age 9, did my own laundry by 10, and managed my homework and school projects without any parental oversight. While other kids had parents checking their assignments and helping with science fair projects, I was completely on my own. It wasn't the childhood I deserved, but it was preparing me for a future where I would have to save myself. By the time I reached high school, I had fully embraced my role as the invisible child in our household. I came and went as I pleased, my parents rarely asking where I had been or who I was with. Not that they were neglectful in the traditional sense. There was always food in the refrigerator, clothes in my closet, and money for school supplies. What was missing was their presence, their interest, their awareness, that I was a person with thoughts, feelings, and needs. My sophomore year, I won first place in a statewide art competition. My piece, a mixed media collage titled Invisible, featured a girl fading into the background of a family portrait. The local newspaper ran a story about it, complete with a photo of me holding my artwork. I left the newspaper open on the kitchen table for 3 days. Neither of my parents mentioned it. That same year, I caught the flu during midterms. It was January, and my father was at a healthcare conference in Chicago, while my mother was on a real estate retreat in Arizona. I had a fever of 103 degrees for 4 days straight. I might have ended up in the hospital if not for our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who came by to drop off a package that had been delivered to her house by mistake. She found me delirious with fever, the house freezing because I hadn't been able to figure out why the heat wasn't working. She stayed with me, called the doctor, and fixed the furnace. When my parents finally returned 5 days later, they seemed more annoyed by the disruption to their schedules than concerned about my health. "You should have called us if it was serious," my mother said, as if I hadn't sent multiple texts and left voicemails that went unanswered. Mrs. Patterson confronted them in our driveway the next day. I couldn't hear what was said, but my mother came inside with tight lips and my father slammed the car door hard enough to shake the windows. Nothing changed after that confrontation, except that my parents seemed to grow even more distant, as if my illness had been an inconvenience that highlighted their failings. As my parents retreated further into their careers, I created a family of my own choosing. My best friend Zoe had parents who invited me for dinner at least once a week. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell would ask about my classes, my art projects, and my plans for the future with genuine interest. They came to my debate tournaments and cheered loudly when our team won the regional championship. "You always have a place at our table, Alyssa," Mrs. Blackwell told me. "No invitation needed." Another lifeline was my high school art teacher, Ms. Sullivan. She recognized my talent early on and pushed me to develop it, staying after school to teach me new techniques and helping me build a portfolio for college applications. More than that, she became the mother figure I so desperately needed. "Art saved my life when I was your age," she confided one afternoon as we worked on a series of prints. "I see that same fire in you, that need to express what can't be said aloud. Don't ever let that fire go out." It was Ms. Sullivan who first suggested I look into art therapy as a potential career. "You have a gift for helping others process their emotions through creativity," she said after watching me work with a freshman who was struggling after her parents' divorce. "You could make a real difference in people's lives." With Ms. Sullivan's guidance and without any input from my parents, I researched colleges with strong art therapy programs. I applied for scholarships, wrote essays, and compiled my portfolio. When my acceptance letter from the Massachusetts College of Art and Design arrived with a substantial scholarship offer, I celebrated with Zoe's family and Ms. Sullivan. My parents' response when I told them at dinner that night was predictably underwhelming. "Massachusetts. That's far," my father commented without looking up from his steak. "The scholarship only covers tuition." "How do you plan to pay for housing and food?" my mother asked her, tone making it clear she considered this a fatal flaw in my plan. I had already done the math, mapped out a budget, and secured a part-time job in the campus bookstore. I had been planning my escape for years, squirreling away babysitting money and cash gifts from my grandmother. I didn't need their approval or their help. I just wanted them to care. The night before graduation, I made one last attempt to connect with them. I asked if we could have dinner together, just the three of us, to celebrate my accomplishment. Surprisingly, they agreed, and we went to the nicest restaurant in town. For a brief moment, sitting across from them in that dimly lit dining room, I allowed myself to hope that things might change. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished, Alyssa," my father said, raising his glass in a toast. For one dizzying second, I felt seen. Then his phone rang, and he spent the next 30 minutes discussing hospital business at the table. My mother used that time to scroll through property listings on her tablet. By the time dessert arrived, I was effectively dining alone, just as I had been my entire life. The next day, as I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I searched the audience for my parents' faces. They were there, physically present, but mentally elsewhere. My father checking his watch, and my mother scanning the crowd as if looking for potential clients. In that moment, I made a decision that would alter the course of my life. I would go to Massachusetts, and I would build a life where I was valued, seen, and heard. I would leave Idaho and everything it represented behind. Yeah, moving 3,000 miles across the country should have been terrifying, but as the plane took off from Boise, all I felt was relief. The further east we flew, the lighter I felt, as if the weight of my parents' indifference was being lifted with each passing state. Boston was everything Idaho wasn't: bustling, diverse, and full of possibilities. The campus of Massachusetts College of Art and Design became my new home, a place where creativity was celebrated and emotional expression encouraged. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who were interested in the same things I was, who spoke my language of color, form, and meaning. There were moments of homesickness, but they surprised me. I didn't miss my parents or our cold, empty house. I missed my grandmother's warm kitchen and the comfort of Zoe's family dinners. I missed Ms. Sullivan's art room with its smell of paint and possibility. I called my grandmother weekly, and she delighted in hearing about my new adventures. My parents, however, were another story. The first holiday season away from home was revealing. Thanksgiving came and went without a call from either of my parents. I had expected at least a perfunctory check-in, but my phone remained silent. When I called them on Thanksgiving evening, my mother answered distractedly. "Oh, Alyssa, your father and I are at the Hendersons' party. Can I call you back tomorrow?" She didn't call back the next day or the day after. Christmas brought a card with a check enclosed, but no personal message. I sent them gifts I had carefully selected: a leather portfolio for my father and a handcrafted jewelry box for my mother. I never heard whether they liked them or even received them. Meanwhile, I was being folded into new families. My roommate Jessica came from a large, boisterous Italian-American family in nearby Revere. When she learned I had nowhere to go for Thanksgiving, she immediately invited me home. "Nobody should be alone on Thanksgiving," she declared. "Besides, my mum always makes enough food for an army." The DiNapoli household was everything my childhood home wasn't: warm, chaotic, and full of life. Mrs. DiNapoli hugged me the moment I walked through the door. Mr. DiNapoli insisted I try his homemade wine. Jessica's brothers, cousins, aunts, and uncles all welcomed me as if I'd always been part of their family. By the end of the weekend, Mrs. DiNapoli was sending me back to campus with containers of leftovers and an open invitation to return any time. "Family isn't just blood, sweetheart," she told me, as she pressed a container of cannoli into my hands. "It's who makes room for you at their table." Her words echoed my grandmother's advice from years ago, and I began to understand what it meant to find my people. At college, I thrived academically and socially. I maintained a near-perfect GPA while working part-time at the campus bookstore and later at a local cafe. I joined the Student Art Therapy Association and volunteered at a children's hospital using art to help young patients express their fears and hopes during treatment. Communication with my parents dwindled further. Our weekly phone calls became monthly, then quarterly. When we did speak, the conversations were superficial and one-sided. They would talk about the hospital's latest acquisition or my mother's record-breaking property sale, rarely asking about my studies or my life. I became adept at ending these calls quickly, manufacturing excuses about study groups or work shifts. During my junior year, I discovered my true calling. As part of my coursework, I interned at a center for children who had experienced trauma. Working with these kids using art to help them process experiences too painful for words, I found purpose and healing. Each child who made progress also helped me understand my own childhood wounds. I wasn't just building a career, I was rebuilding myself. My senior thesis project explored emotional neglect through a series of interactive installations. Viewers walked through spaces that gradually transformed from cold, stark environments to warm, nurturing ones, symbolizing the journey from isolation to connection. My professors praised its emotional depth and technical skill. One even suggested I submit it to a prestigious graduate exhibition. When graduation day arrived, Jessica's entire extended family attended, cheering loudly when my name was called. My grandmother made the trip despite her arthritis making travel difficult. My parents, however, sent a text the week before, explaining they would be unable to attend due to an important hospital fundraiser that my father couldn't miss. I had expected their absence, but it still stung. As I stood with Jessica's family for photos after the ceremony, Mr. DiNapoli placed his arm around my shoulders. "We're proud of you, kid," he said gruffly. "Really proud." I cried then, not from sadness, but from the realization that I had found what I had been searching for all my life. People who showed up, who saw me, who celebrated my accomplishments and comforted me in my disappointments. I had found family. That night, as my grandmother and I shared a quiet dinner, she handed me a small box. Inside was her mother's ring, a simple gold band with a small pearl. "I want you to have this now," she said. "You've become such a strong, remarkable young woman, Alyssa. I know your journey hasn't been easy, but you've created your own path with grace and determination. I couldn't be prouder." As I hugged her goodbye at the airport the next day, I made a promise to myself. I would build a life filled with meaningful connections. I would create a home that was warm and welcoming, and I would limit my contact with my parents to protect the peace and self-worth I had worked so hard to establish. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was a necessary one for my mental health and future happiness. Some relationships I was learning could not be fixed through effort alone. Some distances could not be bridged by wishful thinking. Sometimes the kindest thing you could do for yourself was to accept what was and move forward. And after graduation, I stayed in Boston, drawn to its vibrant arts community and the network of friends and mentors I had built during college. With Jessica and 2 other friends from art school, I found an affordable apartment in Somerville, a diverse neighborhood just outside the city center. Our place was small but full of character with mismatched furniture we rescued from thrift stores and walls covered in our artwork. My first professional step was securing an internship in the art therapy department at Boston Children's Hospital. The position paid barely enough to cover my share of the rent, but the experience was invaluable. I worked with children facing serious illnesses, helping them express their fears, pain, and hopes through art when words failed them. There was 8-year-old Marcus fighting leukemia, who created superhero comics, where the hero always defeated the villain called Cancer Cell. 12-year-old Sophie awaiting a heart transplant, who painted landscapes of places she dreamed of visiting once she was well. 4-year-old Lily recovering from a car accident that took her mother, who could only communicate her grief through finger painting in dark, stormy colours, that gradually, session by session, began to include patches of light. Working with these children, witnessing their resilience, and helping them find their voices healed something in me too. Each breakthrough with a patient was also a personal victory, a reminder that pain could be transformed into something meaningful. While building my professional life, I was also working on my personal healing. On the recommendation of my supervisor at the hospital, I began seeing a therapist who specialized in childhood emotional neglect. Dr. Marina Patel helped me understand the patterns that had shaped me and how they continued to influence my relationships and self-perception. Children who don't receive adequate attention and nurturing often develop certain adaptive traits, she explained during one session. High achievement, self-reliance, people-pleasing difficulty, identifying and expressing emotions. These helped you survive your childhood, Alyssa, but some of these traits may not serve you well in adult relationships. Over months of therapy, I began to recognize how I kept people at a distance, afraid to need anyone too much. I saw how I overworked myself still unconsciously, trying to earn the approval that never came. I learned to identify my emotions instead of burying them under layers of busyness and accomplishment. It was during this period of self-discovery that I met David. He came into the cafe where I worked part-time, ordered a complicated coffee drink, and then left a generous tip along with a note complimenting the small drawing I had done on the specials board. He returned the next day and the next, until finally I agreed to meet him after my shift. David was a software engineer who had moved to Boston from California for work. He was kind, thoughtful, and refreshingly direct. On our 3rd date, when I mentioned in passing that my parents and I weren't close, he asked questions that showed genuine interest, rather than just polite curiosity. He listened without judgment as I shared parts of my story, and he didn't offer platitudes about how all families have problems or how blood is thicker than water. "That sounds incredibly lonely," he said instead. "I'm sorry you didn't get the parents you deserved." As our relationship deepened, I was struck by the stark contrast between David's family and my own. His parents called him several times a week just to chat. They sent care packages with his favorite cookies and handwritten notes. When they visited Boston, they insisted on taking both of us to dinner and asked thoughtful questions about my work and interests. "My mum wants to know if you have any dietary restrictions for Thanksgiving," David said about 6 months into our relationship. "They're assuming you're coming home with me, but I told them I needed to check with you first." The invitation touched me deeply, but it also triggered anxiety. I had been gradually reducing contact with my own parents, our communication limited to perfunctory holiday cards and occasional text messages. The previous Christmas, I had sent a card with my new address in Somerville, but received no acknowledgement that they had even noticed I had moved. I decided to accept David's invitation, and Thanksgiving with the Chen family was a revelation. Their home in San Jose was modest compared to the house I grew up in, but it was bursting with warmth and laughter. David's mother taught me to make dumplings, his father showed me his collection of vinyl records, and his younger sister immediately treated me like a friend she had known for years. "You fit right in," David told me as we flew back to Boston. "They absolutely adore you." "Is it always like that?" I asked. "So warm and connected." "Pretty much," he said, then paused. "Was it too much?" "No," I replied, wiping away unexpected tears. "It was perfect. It's just so different from what I grew up with." By my 26th birthday, my life had taken shape in ways that filled me with quiet pride. I had completed my licensing requirements and opened a small practice specializing in art therapy for children who had experienced trauma or serious illness. I was sharing an apartment with David in a neighborhood we both loved. I had friends who felt like family and work that felt like purpose. The last time I had seen my parents in person was 3 years earlier when I had flown to Idaho for a weekend at my grandmother's insistence. The visit had been awkward and strained. My father had been called to the hospital for an emergency that somehow required his physical presence on a Saturday afternoon. My mother had spent most of the time showing me listings on her tablet and suggesting I consider moving back to Idaho to settle down properly. When I mentioned my thriving practice and satisfying life in Boston, she waved it away as if I were describing a temporary hobby rather than a career I had worked hard to build. The visit ended with an argument when my mother made a dismissive comment about those people who think making art is a real job. I left a day early, and on the flight back to Boston, I made the decision to stop trying. I would maintain minimal contact for my grandmother's sake, but I would no longer exhaust myself seeking approval or recognition that would never come. When I moved in with David 6 months later, I didn't provide my parents with our new address. I doubted they would notice, and I was right. Christmas cards sent to my old address were apparently not returned, or if they were, my parents didn't bother to contact me about it. Birthdays and holidays passed without calls. Life went on, and I was finally at peace with the family I had created for myself rather than the one I had been born into. Until the phone call that changed everything. It was a Sunday morning in April, and David and I were enjoying a lazy breakfast on our small balcony. The spring air was crisp but pleasant, daffodils were blooming in window boxes across the street, and we were discussing plans to visit a new exhibit at the Museum of Fine Arts. My phone rang, displaying a number I hadn't seen in months. My father's cell phone. "Should I answer it?" I asked David, my hand hovering over the screen. "Up to you, he replied. "But you'll probably wonder why he called if you don't." I took a deep breath and answered. "Hello, Alyssa. Where the hell have you been?" My father's voice was sharp with anger. "We've been trying to reach you for weeks." The claim was absurd. My phone showed no missed calls from either of my parents, but I kept my voice calm. "I've had the same phone number for years, Dad. If you needed to reach me, you could have called any time. We sent someone to your apartment in Somerville. The current tenant said you moved out over a year ago. Why didn't you tell us you were moving?" I almost laughed at the audacity. "I've lived with David for 14 months now. I didn't think you'd notice or care, honestly." There was a pause, and I could practically feel my father's anger building on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice had that controlled, administrative tone he used when dealing with difficult hospital staff. "Your grandmother is very ill, Alyssa. Cancer, stage 4. The doctors are not optimistic." The news hit me like a physical blow. Grandma Rose, my anchor, my one true family connection, was dying. I gripped the phone tighter, tears springing to my eyes. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I demanded, my own anger rising. "How long have you known?" "That's not important right now," my father dismissed. "What's important is that there are family matters that need your attention. Property issues specifically. Your grandmother's house." Of course. This wasn't a call about family concern or even to inform me of my grandmother's illness. This was about property and money. I should have known. "I need you to come home within the next 2 weeks, my father continued. "There are documents that require your signature, and frankly, your grandmother has been asking for you." That last part cut through my anger. Grandma Rose wanted to see me. Whatever my feelings about my parents, I couldn't ignore that. "I'll need to check my schedule," I began, but my father cut me off. "This isn't optional, Alyssa. If you don't come home and handle this properly, I'll have no choice but to revise certain arrangements in the family estate planning. Your grandmother made sure you were included in her will, but that can be changed if necessary." The threat was clear and entirely in character. My father had always viewed money as the ultimate leverage. What stunned me was the realization that my grandmother had apparently made provisions for me in her will, and my father was now using that as a bargaining chip. "Are you seriously threatening to disinherit me if I don't drop everything and come to Idaho on your schedule?" I asked, my voice shaking with disbelief. "I'm simply stating facts," he replied coldly. "Family obligations go both ways, Alyssa. You can't just take what you want and give nothing in return." The irony of him lecturing me about family obligations was too much. 27 years of emotional neglect, and he had the nerve to talk about what I owed them. "Text me the details about Grandma," I said finally. "Which hospital room number, her doctor's name. I'll make arrangements." I ended the call before he could respond, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone. David was beside me instantly, his arm around my shoulders. "What happened?" he asked gently. As I recounted the conversation, David's expression shifted from concern to anger. "They didn't even tell you your grandmother was sick until they needed something from you. That's beyond neglectful. That's cruel." I called the hospital in Idaho directly, and after navigating a maze of departments, finally reached my grandmother's floor. The nurse who answered was kind but cautious. "Mrs. Collins has been with us for 3 weeks now," she said, confirming my suspicion that my parents had known about the illness for some time without informing me. "She's stable at the moment, but visitors are limited to immediate family." "I'm her granddaughter," I replied. "I'll be flying in from Boston as soon as possible." Next, I called my boss at the therapy center, explaining the situation and requesting emergency leave. She was understanding and supportive, assuring me my clients would be covered by colleagues during my absence. Finally, I called my own therapist, Dr. Patel, and managed to get a same-day appointment. "This is a complex situation with many layers," she said after I explained everything. "Your concern for your grandmother is natural and important, but I'm concerned about how returning to your parents' orbit might affect the progress you've made." "I don't have a choice," I said. "I need to see my grandmother." "You always have choices, Alyssa," she corrected gently. "You can see your grandmother without staying with your parents. You can sign necessary documents without agreeing to their terms. You can maintain boundaries while still honoring your relationship with your grandmother." She helped me develop a plan that would protect my mental health while allowing me to fulfill my obligations to the one person in my family who had always shown me love. I would stay in a hotel, not my parents' house. I would visit my grandmother directly at the hospital before seeing my parents. I would bring a friend or partner for support if possible. That evening, David and I sat down to make practical arrangements. He immediately offered to come with me, taking time off work to provide support. "Are you sure?" I asked. "It's going to be uncomfortable and probably ugly. All the more reason you shouldn't face it alone," he said, squeezing my hand. "Besides, I'd like to meet your grandmother. She sounds like an amazing woman." As we booked flights and a hotel room, I called my grandmother's number, not expecting her to answer. To my surprise, she did, her voice weaker than I remembered, but still warm. "Alyssa, sweetheart, is that you?" "It's me, Grandma," I said, fighting back tears. "I just heard you're in the hospital. Why didn't you call me sooner?" There was a pause. "Your father said he would tell you weeks ago. He promised me he had." This confirmation of my parents' deliberate withholding of information stung, but I pushed past it. "I'm coming to see you, Grandma. David and I will be there in 3 days." "And David," her voice brightened. "You're bringing your young man. Oh, I'd love to meet him." "You'll love him, Grandma. He's kind and funny, and he makes me very happy." "That's all I've ever wanted for you, sweetheart. To be happy." Her voice cracked slightly. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you better when you were little. I should have done more." "You did everything you could," I assured her. "You were my safe place, Grandma. You still are." After we hung up, I discovered a text from my father with the hospital information and a terse, "Let me know your arrival details." Nothing about my grandmother's condition treatment plan or prognosis. Just the bare minimum information I had specifically requested. I also received an email from a law firm I didn't recognize with the subject line, Collins Family Property Trust. The email referred to urgent matters requiring attention and time-sensitive decisions regarding the Rose Collins property holdings. It was becoming increasingly clear that my father's primary concern was not my grandmother's health, but her assets. "This is about money," I told David as I showed him the email. "They need my signature for something related to Grandma's property, and they're using her illness and threats about the will to manipulate me into complying." "Do you know what exactly they need from you?" he asked. No, but I'm going to find out before I sign anything, I replied. I need to talk to Grandma first, and probably a lawyer of my own. As I packed for the trip, I never wanted to take anxiety knotted my stomach. I was returning to the place I had worked so hard to escape, facing the people who had shaped my deepest insecurities. But this time, I wasn't a helpless child or a lonely teenager. I was a competent adult with a support system and boundaries. I was going back on my terms for my grandmother, not for the parents who had never truly seen me. I was still afraid, but underneath the fear was a steady current of resolve. Whatever happened in Idaho, I would not lose myself again. I would not become invisible. I would stand my ground and protect both my grandmother and myself from whatever scheme my father had concocted. As our plane took off 3 days later, David held my hand and said, "Remember, we're going there to see your grandmother and handle some paperwork. We're not going to fix your relationship with your parents or make them suddenly appreciate you. Those aren't realistic goals." "I know," I replied, squeezing his hand gratefully. "The only goal is to be there for Grandma and get through this with my self-respect intact." What I didn't say was that a small, foolish part of me still hoped that somehow this crisis might finally make my parents see me, really see me for the first time in my life. It was an old hope, worn thin by years of disappointment, but it flickered stubbornly in a corner of my heart that I couldn't quite reach to extinguish. The flight to Idaho felt like traveling backward in time. With each passing hour, I could feel myself regressing, old insecurities and anxieties bubbling to the surface, despite all my preparation. By the time we landed, my shoulders were tight with tension, and I had chewed my bottom lip raw. "You okay?" David asked as we collected our luggage. "Not really," I admitted. "Being here brings everything back." He squeezed my hand. "Remember, we're here for your grandmother, not them, and we're leaving in 5 days no matter what." We rented a car at the airport and drove straight to the hospital. I needed to see my grandmother before facing my parents to ground myself in the one genuine family connection I had. The hospital was smaller than the one where I worked in Boston, but had that same antiseptic smell that made my stomach clench with anxiety. Grandma Rose was in a private room on the oncology floor. When I first saw her, I had to stifle a gasp. She had always been petite, but now she seemed diminished, her skin nearly translucent against the white hospital sheets. Her silver hair, once thick and always styled, lay thin against her skull. But when she saw me, her smile was the same warm beacon it had always been. "Alyssa," she said, holding out her arms. "My beautiful girl." I hugged her gently, afraid of hurting her frail body. Up close, I could see how illness had ravaged her, the yellowish tint to her skin suggesting liver involvement. My heart constricted with the realization that I might be saying goodbye sooner than I was prepared for. "Grandma, this is David," I said, pulling him forward. David approached her bed with a warmth that made me love him even more. "Mrs. Collins, it's an honor to meet you. Alyssa talks about you all the time." "Call me Rose," my grandmother insisted, studying him with approval. "Sit down, both of you. Tell me everything about Boston and your life there." For the next hour, we talked about positive things, my practice, David's work, our apartment, and our friends. I showed her pictures on my phone of our neighborhood and the art therapy center where I worked. She listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was truly engaged with my life in a way my parents never had been. Finally, when a nurse came in to check her vitals, I asked the question that had been burning in my mind. "Grandma, why didn't you call me yourself when you got sick? Why let Dad be the one to tell me, especially when he waited so long?" Her expression clouded. "Oh, sweetheart." I tried, but after the first round of chemo, I was so weak, and your father took my phone saying he'd handle everything. She sighed. "I should have known better. Richard has always been selective about which responsibilities he acknowledges. Dad said something about needing my signature for property matters." I probed gently. "Something about your house." My grandmother's face hardened slightly. "Ah, so that's what finally prompted him to contact you." She gestured for me to come closer and lowered her voice. "Listen carefully, Alyssa. I made changes to my will last year. The house and most of my savings are going to you, not your parents. Richard and Diana have plenty of money, but they're furious about my decision. They've been pressuring me to change it back, especially since the diagnosis." My throat tightened. "I don't care about the inheritance, Grandma. I just care about you." "I know that, sweetheart, which is exactly why you deserve it." She patted my hand. "But there's more. They need your signature because I put the house in a trust with you as co-trustee, specifically to prevent them from selling it before I'm gone. That's what this is all about. They want to sell my home while I'm still alive, claiming it's to pay for my medical expenses, but I have excellent insurance and savings for that. I was stunned by this revelation. My father's urgent summons wasn't about family unity in a time of crisis or even about my grandmother's health. It was a calculated move to circumvent her wishes regarding her own property. "What do you want me to do, Grandma?" I asked. "I want you to stand your ground," she replied firmly. "Don't sign anything until you've spoken with my lawyer, Martin Whitaker. I've already called him to expect you." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "And Alyssa, I want you to know how proud I am of the woman you've become, how you've built a beautiful life despite everything. Whatever happens with the house or the money, that's what matters to me." By the time we left the hospital, visiting hours were over and I was emotionally exhausted. David suggested we check into our hotel and face my parents the next day, but I knew delaying would only increase my anxiety. I texted my father that we would stop by for a brief visit before dinner. The drive to my childhood home was surreal. Nothing had changed: the same manicured lawn, the same pristine exterior that hid the emotional emptiness within. As David parked in the driveway, I took a deep breath. "Remember," he said quietly, "we're just here for a quick hello. We don't owe them anything more than basic courtesy." The front door opened before we reached it. My mother stood in the doorway, as immaculately put together as always, in designer clothes and perfect makeup, her expression unreadable. "Alyssa," she said, her tone neutral. "You're finally here." Her gaze shifted to David. "And you brought a friend." "This is David Chen, my partner," I corrected. "David, this is my mother, Diana Collins." My mother barely acknowledged the introduction, turning to lead us into the house, without a handshake or greeting. The interior was as cold and impersonal as I remembered, more like a furniture showroom than a home. My father was in his study, seated behind the large mahogany desk that had always seemed to serve as a barrier between him and the rest of the world. He stood when we entered, his expression stern. "You could have called earlier to let us know you'd arrived," he said by way of greeting. "We went to see Grandma first," I replied, not apologizing. "She was surprised you waited so long to tell me she was sick." My father's jaw tightened. "There were considerations you're not aware of. Medical decisions, treatment options." "What considerations required keeping her illness secret from me for weeks?" I challenged. "We're not doing this now," my mother interjected, finally looking up from her phone. "Your father has been under tremendous stress managing your grandmother's care on top of his hospital responsibilities." I bit back a retort about their selective attention to family obligations. "I understand from Grandma that you need my signature regarding her house." She suggested I speak with her lawyer first. My father's expression darkened. "Your grandmother is not thinking clearly. The medications affect her cognitive function. The house needs to be sold quickly to cover specialized treatment options that insurance won't cover." It was a convincing lie, one I might have believed if my grandmother hadn't already told me the truth. I remembered Dr. Patel's advice about maintaining boundaries while fulfilling obligations. "I'll meet with Mr. Whitaker tomorrow morning," I said firmly. "After I understand the legal situation, we can discuss next steps." "This isn't a negotiation, Alyssa," my father said, his voice taking on the steely quality I remembered from childhood confrontations. "The papers are prepared and require immediate action. Your grandmother's treatment depends on this." David, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "It seems reasonable to review legal documents before signing them, especially when they involve significant assets. I'm sure you would do the same, Mr. Collins." My father's gaze snapped to David, as if truly noticing him for the first time. "And you are?" "David Chen. I'm a software engineer from Boston, and I've been with Alyssa for nearly 2 years now." 2 years, my mother repeated, a hint of surprise in her voice. "Alyssa never mentioned you." "Just as you never mentioned Grandma's cancer," I countered. "It seems we all have communication issues in this family." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. My father broke it by reaching into a drawer and pulling out a folder. "These are the documents requiring your signature," he said, pushing them across the desk. "Review them tonight if you must, but I need them signed by tomorrow afternoon. The real estate agent has a potential buyer who won't wait." I made no move to take the folder. "I'll review them after meeting with Mr. Whitaker." "This stubbornness is unnecessary and frankly childish," my father snapped. "After years of minimal contact, you choose now to dig in your heels when your grandmother's health is at stake. I find it interesting that you're concerned about my level of contact with the family." I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Especially considering neither of you noticed or cared when I moved across the country. Did you even realize I changed apartments in Boston over a year ago?" My mother looked uncomfortable for the first time. We've been busy, Alyssa. Your father's hospital acquired 2 new facilities, and I've expanded my real estate business to the next county. You've always been busy, I replied. Too busy to come to my college graduation. Too busy to call on my birthday. Too busy to notice I existed unless you needed something from me. That's an exaggeration, my father dismissed. We provided everything you needed growing up. A beautiful home, the best schools, plenty of spending money. Many children would have been grateful. I needed parents who showed up, I said, my voice catching, who remembered my school events, who asked about my day, who noticed when I was sick or sad or scared. Oh, please, my mother sighed. Not this again. We weren't perfect, Alyssa, but we did our best. This victim narrative is getting tiresome. David tensed beside me, and I placed a hand on his arm to stop whatever he was about to say. This was my battle. I'm not here to rehash the past, I said, though every word felt like ripping open an old wound. I'm here for Grandma. I'll meet with her lawyer tomorrow, and then we can discuss the house. Until then, there's nothing more to say. I stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. My father's face flushed with anger. If you walk out now, there will be consequences, he warned. Financial consequences. Are you threatening to disinherit me again? I asked. Go ahead. I built my life without your money or support. I can continue doing so. We gave you everything, my mother said, finally showing some emotion. What more did you want from us? The question hung in the air, so perfect in its obliviousness that it almost made me laugh. Instead, I looked directly at her, then at my father. You never noticed me when I was here, I said quietly. Why would you notice when I was gone? With that, I turned and walked out, David close behind me. Neither of my parents called after us or tried to stop us. As we got into the rental car, the enormity of what had just happened hit me, and I began to shake. You were amazing in there, David said, starting the car. So strong and clear. I don't feel strong, I admitted as tears finally came. I feel like that invisible little girl again. But you're not, he reminded me. You stood up to them, you set boundaries, you spoke your truth. The little girl couldn't do any of that. At the hotel, I broke down completely, sobbing into the pillow as years of suppressed grief and anger poured out. David held me through it, offering tissues and water, but no empty reassurances. When the storm finally passed, I felt hollowed out but strangely peaceful. I need to call Mr. Whitaker, I said, sitting up and reaching for my phone. The lawyer agreed to meet first thing in the morning. After a room service dinner neither of us had much appetite for, I checked my phone to find 3 missed calls from my father and a text that simply read, "This behavior is disappointing, but not surprising." I showed it to David. 27 years of emotional neglect, and I'm the one who's disappointing. Classic projection, he replied. They're the ones who failed, but they can't admit that to themselves and their mates, so they make it your fault. The next morning, Mr. Whitaker confirmed everything my grandmother had told me. The house had been placed in a trust with specific provisions to prevent its sale during her lifetime, unless both trustees, myself and my grandmother, agreed it was necessary. Your father has been pressuring Rose to dissolve the trust for months, the elderly lawyer explained. Even before the cancer diagnosis. The property has appreciated significantly since a new technology company opened a campus nearby. It's worth nearly triple what it was 5 years ago. So this isn't about medical expenses at all, I said, though I had already suspected as much. No, Mr. Whitaker confirmed. Your grandmother has excellent coverage through her late husband's pension plan plus substantial savings. This is about your father wanting to cash in on the property boom before values potentially drop again. Armed with this information and copies of the trust documents, I met my parents at their house that afternoon. My father had brought in his own lawyer, a slick corporate type, who immediately tried to overwhelm me with legal jargon. I cut him off politely but firmly. I've reviewed the trust documents with Mr. Whitaker. I understand my role as co-trustee and my grandmother's wishes regarding her property. I will not be signing any authorization to sell the house. My father's face turned an alarming shade of red. This is outrageous. Your grandmother needs specialized treatment that insurance won't cover. Mr. Whitaker has shown me her insurance policy and coverage details, I countered. Everything she needs is covered, plus she has savings set aside specifically for medical contingencies. You've always been difficult, my father snapped. Always had to do things your way without considering how it affects others. The irony was so thick I could almost touch it. I learned independence from experts, I replied. Two people so self-absorbed they didn't notice when their only child moved across the country. My mother stood abruptly. "I won't sit here and be insulted in my own home." "Then don't insult my intelligence by pretending this is about Grandma's medical needs," I retorted. "It's about money, as it always has been with you two. Money and appearances. If you don't sign these papers," my father threatened, "you will be removed from the will entirely, both our will and your grandmother's." "You can remove me from your will," I acknowledged. "That's your right. But you can't change Grandma's will without her consent, and I've already spoken with her about this. She's been declared legally competent by two separate physicians specifically to prevent any challenges to her estate plans." My father's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, confirming I had hit on the truth. They had probably been planning to claim my grandmother was not of sound mind to make financial decisions. "I'll be staying in town for 4 more days." I continued, standing to leave. "I'll be spending that time with Grandma at the hospital, not arguing about property she has made clear she doesn't want sold. If either of you would like to discuss how to better support her actual needs during her illness, I'm happy to have that conversation." I walked out with my head high, ignoring my father's angry calls to come back. In the car, I finally allowed myself a shaky exhale. "That was impressive," David said. "You didn't let them manipulate or intimidate you at all." "I'm still shaking," I admitted. "But it feels good to stand up to them to protect Grandma the way she always tried to protect me." Over the next few days, I spent every available visiting hour with my grandmother, sometimes with David, sometimes alone. We talked about her treatment options, her hopes and fears, and her wishes for the future. I told her about the confrontation with my parents, and she nodded with grim satisfaction. "They never understood what matters," she said. "Not money or status, but connection, love, being present for the people who need you." On our last day in Idaho, I made arrangements with a lawyer to create a healthcare proxy designating me as my grandmother's medical decision maker, should she become unable to make her own choices. I also set up a trust specifically for her medical expenses, funded by some of her investments, but structured to prevent my parents from accessing the money. As David and I prepared to leave for the airport, my grandmother held my hand tightly. "I have one more favor to ask you, Alyssa, a big one." "Anything, Grandma," I promised. "When the time comes when treatment stops working," she said, her voice steady, despite the difficult subject. "I want to come to Boston. I don't want to die in this town with only your parents making occasional duty visits. I want to be near you." Tears filled my eyes. "Of course, Grandma. We'll make it happen. My building has an elevator and there's a small guest room in our apartment. It's not fancy, but it will be perfect because you're there," she interrupted. "That's all that matters to me." My parents made no appearance at the hospital to say goodbye, nor did they contact me before my departure. Their silence was both hurtful and liberating, a final confirmation that nothing had changed and nothing would change. The fantasy I had harbored since childhood, that someday they would see me and value me, finally began to fade. On the flight back to Boston, I leaned my head on David's shoulder. "Thank you for coming with me, for witnessing all of that." "Of course," he said, kissing the top of my head. "That's what partners do, they show up." "They show up," I repeated softly. Such a simple concept, but one my parents had never grasped. Being physically present wasn't enough. You had to be emotionally present too. You had to see the people you claim to love, really see them in all their complexity and need. As the plane rose above the clouds, I felt something settle within me, a quiet certainty that regardless of what happened next, I would be okay. I had built a life filled with people who showed up, who saw me clearly and loved me anyway. I had become visible after all, not to the parents who should have cherished me, but to those who chose to. And somehow that was enough. 6 months after our trip to Idaho, my life had transformed in ways I never could have anticipated. The most significant change was the arrival of my grandmother, who had moved into our spare bedroom 3 months earlier, when her oncologist confirmed that her cancer had spread, despite aggressive treatment. Rather than continue with interventions that would diminish her quality of life without extending it meaningfully, she had chosen comfort care and the chance to spend her remaining time with me. The transition hadn't been easy. David and I had scrambled to adapt our apartment, installing grab bars in the bathroom and renting a hospital bed that barely fit in the small guest room. We coordinated with hospice services, managed medications, and adjusted our work schedules to ensure someone was always home. But despite the challenges, having my grandmother with us felt right, like completing a circle that had begun in her warm kitchen so many years ago when she was the only one who truly saw me. "This view is much nicer than the hospital," she remarked one afternoon as we sat on the balcony, a blanket tucked around her increasingly frail body. From our third-floor apartment, we could see a small park where children played and dog walkers chatted. "There's so much life here." My parents' reaction to her move had been predictably self-centered. My father had left angry voicemails about kidnapping and undue influence, while my mother sent passive-aggressive texts suggesting I was disrupting proper medical care for my own convenience. Neither of them had offered to visit or even video call my grandmother since she arrived in Boston. Their absence was noted, but not mourned. My grandmother had built her own connections in her new city, charming the hospice nurses, befriending our elderly neighbor Mrs. Abramowitz, and even joining a weekly card game in the building's community room when she felt strong enough. She had integrated seamlessly into our chosen family, delighting in Sunday dinners with Jessica's large Italian clan and quiet evenings with David's parents, who visited from California specifically to meet her. The legal threats from my parents had escalated after my grandmother's move. Their lawyer had sent formal letters claiming I had manipulated an ill elderly woman and demanding she be returned to Idaho immediately. My grandmother's lawyer, Mr. Whitaker, had handled each communication with professional firmness, providing medical documentation of her competence to make her own decisions and copies of the healthcare proxy she had signed. When financial threats didn't work, my father tried emotional manipulation, sending a letter that began with concern about my grandmother's well-being, but quickly devolved into accusations about my lifelong selfishness and inability to consider others. I had shown the letter to Dr. Patel during therapy. "This is classic projection," she had said, echoing David's earlier assessment. "He's describing himself, not you. The fact that you recognize this pattern now is tremendous progress, Alyssa." And it was progress. A year earlier, such a letter would have devastated me, reopening childhood wounds and triggering desperate attempts to earn approval. Now I could see it for what it was, the flailing of a man who had never developed the emotional tools to connect authentically with others, who viewed relationships as transactions and love as conditional. My professional life had adjusted to accommodate my grandmother's care. I had reduced my client load slightly, but continued my practice, finding that my work with traumatized children had taken on new depth as I processed my own family dynamics. I had started a support group for adult children of emotionally neglectful parents, which had quickly become one of the most rewarding aspects of my practice. One rainy evening in October, as my grandmother dozed in her recliner and David worked late at the office, I received an unexpected email from my mother. Unlike my father's angry communications, this one seemed tentative, almost hesitant. "Alyssa," it began, "I've been thinking about some of the things you said during your visit, about feeling invisible growing up. I'm not good at this kind of reflection, but something happened at work yesterday that made me wonder if you might have had a point." She went on to describe showing a house to a young family where the mother had interrupted the tour to attend to her daughter's scraped knee, kissing it and listening to the child's dramatic retelling of the playground accident that caused it. "I found myself watching them and feeling something I couldn't name at first," my mother wrote. "Later I realized it was envy, maybe even shame. I don't remember ever stopping a showing to comfort you that way. I don't remember listening to your stories about school or friends. I don't think I knew how." It wasn't an apology, not really. There was no acknowledgement of the damage done or explicit recognition of her role in my painful childhood. But it was perhaps the most honest communication I had ever received from her, a small crack in the perfect facade she had maintained my entire life. I showed the email to my grandmother when she woke from her nap. She read it slowly, her eyes clouded with emotion. "Your mother had a difficult upbringing herself," she said finally. "Not that it excuses anything, but Diana's parents were cold, demanding people. Your grandfather never approved of her marrying Richard, and he cut her off financially. I think she learned early that success and money were the only measures of worth." I hadn't known this about my mother's background. Like so many family histories, it had been buried beneath layers of pretense and performance. "Do you think I should respond?" I asked. My grandmother handed back my phone. "That depends on what you need, sweetheart. Not what she needs or what might repair the relationship, but what you need for your own healing." After careful consideration and a session with Dr. Patel, I crafted a measured response. I acknowledged my mother's reflection without absolving her of responsibility. I expressed willingness to engage in further conversation if she was genuinely interested in understanding my experience, but I set clear boundaries about the type of relationship I was prepared to have moving forward. "I don't expect or need you to transform into a different person," I wrote. but I do need basic respect and recognition of my autonomy. I need acknowledgement of the past without defensiveness or denial. I need interactions that don't leave me feeling diminished or invisible. My mother's reply came 2 days later, shorter but equally thoughtful. I'm not sure I know how to be the person you need me to be, she admitted, but I'm willing to try to understand better. Maybe we could talk on the phone sometimes. It was a small opening, a narrow window into possibility. Not reconciliation, not yet, but perhaps a beginning of something new. I agreed to a monthly phone call starting in November. My expectations were modest, my boundaries firm. Whatever came of this tentative connection, I was approaching it from a position of strength rather than need. My father, in contrast, had doubled down on his anger. When financial threats and legal maneuvers failed to achieve his goals, he had resorted to complete silence. No calls, no emails, not even to inquire about his mother's declining health. My grandmother was saddened but not surprised by his response. "Richard has always had your grandfather's worst traits," she told me one evening as I helped her prepare for bed. The rigidity, the inability to admit wrongdoing, the equation of vulnerability with weakness. I tried to soften those edges when he was young, but I failed. "You didn't fail, Grandma," I assured her. "You did your best with the tools you had, just like I'm doing now." She smiled, reaching up to touch my cheek. "You've become such a wise woman, Alyssa. So much stronger than I was at your age. I wish I had protected you better from their neglect." "You did protect me," I insisted. "You were my safe harbor, the one place I knew I would be seen and heard. Without you, I might never have developed the capacity for real connection at all." As autumn deepened into winter, my grandmother's condition deteriorated. The hospice nurse prepared us for what was coming, explaining the signs of approaching death with gentle frankness. David and I took turns sitting with her, reading her favorite poems, playing soft music, or simply holding her hand in comfortable silence. In late November, during a surprisingly warm spell that allowed us to open the windows to fresh air, David knelt beside my grandmother's bed and showed her a small velvet box. "I wanted to ask for your blessing," he said. "I'm planning to ask Alyssa to marry me on Christmas Eve." My grandmother's face lit up with joy, more animated than I had seen her in weeks. "You already have it, David. You're the partner she deserves, someone who truly sees her." 2 days later, as the first snow of the season dusted our balcony, my grandmother slipped away peacefully in her sleep, my hand in hers. The grief was overwhelming, but clean somehow, untainted by regret or unfinished business. We had said everything that needed saying. She had known she was loved. The funeral was small and intimate, held in Boston rather than Idaho, as per my grandmother's wishes. Jessica's family came in force, bringing enough food to feed a small army. David's parents flew in from California. Colleagues from the therapy center, neighbors from our building, even some of my clients' parents attended. My mother came alone, standing awkwardly at the back until I invited her to sit with us. My father did not come at all. In the months that followed, I learnt to live with grief while still embracing joy. David proposed as planned on Christmas Eve, and we set a date for the following summer. I expanded my practice, specializing more deeply in working with children affected by emotional neglect. I maintained monthly calls with my mother, which were sometimes stilted, sometimes surprisingly meaningful, always carefully bounded. My father remained absent, a ghostly presence in family stories, but not in my daily life. I had sent him a brief email after my grandmother's death, informing him of the funeral arrangements and expressing openness to his attendance. His response had been a formal note, through his lawyer, declining to attend and requesting immediate information about the execution of his mother's will. It was sad, but clarifying. Some relationships cannot be healed, some patterns run too deep to be broken. Accepting this truth was part of my own healing journey. Spring came, bringing new life to the small garden my grandmother and I had planted on our balcony. Tulips she had carefully selected pushed through the soil, their vibrant colors a reminder of her enduring influence. David and I began looking for a larger apartment somewhere, with enough space for a home office, and perhaps someday a nursery. On what would have been my grandmother's 83rd birthday, I sat on the balcony among her flowers and opened the journal she had left for me, a final gift to be read after she was gone. Inside, in her elegant handwriting, was a lifetime of wisdom distilled into one powerful message. "My dearest Alyssa," she had written, "remember that your worth was never dependent on your parents' ability to see it. You were always deserving of love, always complete, always enough. The family that matters is the one you choose and the one that chooses you in return. The people who show up, who see you clearly, who celebrate your joy and share your pain. You have built such a family now, and watching you do so has been the greatest privilege of my life. Carry this knowledge forward, sweet girl. Being truly seen is a gift, but learning to truly see others is a legacy. As I closed the journal, tears streaming down my face, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The journey from invisible child to seen and cherished adult had been long and often painful, but I had arrived. The neglect that had shaped my early years no longer defined me. The parents who had failed to notice my absence no longer held power over my sense of self. I had built a life filled with meaningful connections, purposeful work, and authentic joy. I had learned to set boundaries without building walls. I had discovered that family is not determined by blood, but by presence, not by obligation, but by choice. And perhaps most importantly, I had learned that being seen begins with seeing yourself clearly, with acknowledging your own worth, independent of others' recognition or approval. It begins with showing up for yourself with the same compassion and attention you wish others had given you. As the spring breeze rustled through my grandmother's tulips, I made a silent promise to her and to myself. I would carry her legacy forward. I would continue to build a life where no one felt invisible. I would create a family, whether through marriage, children, friendship, or community, where everyone was seen, heard, and valued. Because in the end, that's what family should be, not those who share your DNA, but those who share your journey, who witness your struggles and celebrations, who remain present through joy and sorrow alike. The people who notice when you're gone and welcome you home when you return. What about you? Have you ever felt invisible to someone who should have seen you? How did you find your way to being truly seen? Share your story in the comments below, like this video if it resonated with you. Subscribe for more stories of healing and growth, and remember, you deserve to be seen just as you are. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you find the family who sees you, whether they're the one you were born into or the one you create for yourself.